Hello and welcome to my channel. Try this as a series breaking down a certain game or playstyle of a game. Today we're going to be talking Commander and breaking down Wurmspeaker. I break up my videos into chapters covering a variety of the deck's aspects. Go ahead and navigate to whatever you're specifically looking for. You can find them in the description or in the timeline. If you enjoy this content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps other viewers discover the content I produce and is a great way to show support. With that said, let's dive in. Baru is a 3/3 human druid that costs 2 green. His passive ability reads, Worms you control get +2/+2 and have trample. His activated ability costs 7 green and tap him. It reads, create a 4/4 green worm creature token. This ability costs X less to activate, where X is the greatest power among worms you control. Baru is an incredibly effective worm tribal commander. Having a blanket +2/+2 for all creatures in the tribe is a pretty sizable buff to a tribe that normally consists of huge creatures anyway. Giving trample on top of that really enables worms in general. Some have trample to start with, but most don't have any form of evasion. There are other ways in green to enable the tribe in the same way, but having it in the command zone is incredibly powerful. His activated ability is also very strong. This ability essentially costs 2 less by default since he provides a buff to begin with. After we make the first token, the ability only costs 1 in green. I think 2 mana to make 6/6s with trample is an incredibly good deal. So as long as we protect Baru, we will consistently be a threat at the table. In almost every one of my test games, Baru was a menace to deal with. Worms as a tribe aren't normally that scary unless your opponent doesn't run a ton of creatures. They're often just expensive to cast and can be easily chump blocked. Mono green is the best color for ramp, so the expensive mana cost isn't really a problem, and Baru solves the chump blocking issue. They're truly terrifying and very fun to play. Our goal is to just churn out worms onto the battlefield either with a variety of the cards in the 99 or using Baru's ability. Beating down our opponents in combat shouldn't be an issue with this tribe. Our command provides evasion and a great anthem. The deck is very straightforward to run, basically just turn them sideways and beat down your opponents. I never found any need for an alternate win condition for this deck. It's honestly a really flexible and budget friendly tribe overall. Starting off is the auto includes in Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, and Thematic Compass. I've always found Thematic Compass to be a reliable card at any point in the game. It can help ensure land drops in early to mid game and then flip into a strictly better Mazavith to protect us from Voltron commanders and other problem creatures. Worms are generally expensive to cast, so I'm running a pretty aggressive ramp package. Mindstone, Thran Dynamo, and Birds of Paradise are some great mana related cards to add. Birds is admittedly a way overkill for this deck. There's no reason to pick one up for mono green, and a great budget option is just Llanowar War Elves. I like birds just to have a flying blocker, so I generally run it in most decks that can, even if it's just mono green. Cultivate, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits are all cheap cards to cast. They're really effective, with the latter 2 being able to pull things onto the field untapped. Migration Path, Search for Tomorrow, and Explosive Vegetation are some cards we'll ramp into. Search is a really flexible card as we can suspend it as a turn 1 play if we happen to have it in our opening hand. Skyshroud Claim and Template Discovery are 2 ramp cards you'll often see on this channel. I like running fetchable dual or tri-lands in my decks, which I can get with both of these cards. I also like running Temp to just get utility lands and start some interaction with my opponents. They both get lands to the battlefield untapped as well, which is a nice bonus. Herald's Horn and Urza's Incubator will give us some great cost reduction for our tribe. The Horn can also give us some card advantage. It's likely they'll both find some use in this deck, as most of the creatures can fully utilize their cost reductions. I'm also adding Monster Manual and Elvish Piper as 2 ways to cheat out our expensive creatures. They're technically not mana related, but they can save us a ton, so I felt they fit here. Since we can use them both at instant speed, they're essentially combat tricks in this deck. First up is Toski and Aram Frostfang, as 2 creatures provide plenty of card draw. Since we're giving trample as a blanket buff for our tribe, it's very likely we'll get value from these creatures. Beast Whisperer and Grothama are 2 ways for us to draw cards also. Grothama is a little risky to run. It's a devastating creature that we can give trample, but it can potentially give our opponents good value. I think overall it's worth running, as it can hit for a quarter of someone's starting life total on its own. If your pod also enjoys running Timmy decks or Death Touch creatures, then it's probably not worth running though. Next up is Momentous Fall and Greater Good. They can both draw us an insane amount of cards with this tribe. Baru's buff essentially draws us the cards to pay for Greater Good with any worm. It wouldn't matter too much though, as pretty much any worm would go positive with Greater Good anyway. If one of the worms happen to get targeted, we can just draw a ton of cards in response. First up, let's shout out an interesting interaction with Death Touch using Basilisk Collar as an example. So when your creature has trample, you only have to assign lethal damage to the blocking creature, and then the rest moves on to the next creature until you reach the player. Death Touch effects synergize very well with our commander to send even more damage to our opponents. There are better ways to give Death Touch to our creatures, but I like the lifelink the color provides, so it's what I went for in this list. I'll shout out another great effect later in this video. To help with the beatdown strategy is a natural growth. This card really just pours gas all over the board state to make it even more dangerous. The tokens our commander creates are some of the smallest worms in the deck, and even they would be 12/12s with trample assuming our commander is also on the field. Some of the scariest worms in our deck is Wurm Coil Engine, World Spine, and Impervious Great Worm. Each are a terror to see on the field. The first two both create massive tokens if they die. It's actually more scary if they're removed since that's extra power our commander can apply to those tokens. The Great Worm would be an 18/18 with Indestructible and Trample when Borrow is out, making him an absolute monster for our opponents to deal with. Sandworm Convergence, Crush of Worms, and Worm Calling can also provide worm tokens for us. Since Borrow Anthem's tokens also, we can populate the board with tiny worms and let his Anthem carry them the rest of the way. Bellowing Tangleworm, Elder Scale Worm, and Engulfing Slagworm all provide some additional benefits on top of being huge creatures. Bellowing will provide even more evasion to our creatures. Elder Scale can save us from losing the game, and Slagworm can effectively get all of its damage through while also healing us. Worms often have a variety of effects, and a common one is the gain life. Ravenous Linworm, Palaka Worm, and Sifter Worm are some examples. It was actually a pretty effective tribe to set up a life discrepancy with. Though I didn't include any in my list, adding some ETB synergy wouldn't be a bad idea as many of the abilities tied to worms are ETB effects like these ones. The cutting room floor is where I talk about some cards around or over $10 at the time of recording that I cut from my list for various reasons but are worth mentioning to run. Though these cards didn't find a home in my list, they might find a home in yours. First up is Asceticism as a way to both protect and regenerate our creatures. Our worms are pretty expensive to cast and we want to protect them. This is a really effective card in most decks, and with all the ramp we have, we should be able to regenerate most of our board most of the time. I ended up cutting it because it turned out to be a very win more card in this deck. With all the large trample creatures, I normally found it really killed the morale at the table whenever I got Asceticism out. I talked with a couple of opponents about this card. Most didn't really mind it being in the deck, but they also agreed that it sort of made this hopeless board state. In most cases, I had enough power to either eliminate someone in one swing or to completely cripple someone's life total, and this card made things really difficult to deal with. Some would argue that building up such a board state is the goal, and I would normally agree, but in this case, it really felt like it was too much. Next up is Seedborn Muse. This creature really just synergizes with our commander more than anything else. Being able to untap him every turn essentially means make a 6/6 with trample every turn. I never considered running this card in my list because I felt like it would make the deck too aggressive. However, the synergy with Baru makes it probably worth running if you have a copy on hand. Pathbreaker Ebex can give us even more power to swing out with. The worms are generally large creatures, so this is a substantial buff to apply to everything else. It also operates as a backup if Baru is ever dealt with in some way since the Ebex provides trample itself. It's sort of like an upgraded version of our commander honestly, and it's well worth adding. Last up is the Grey Henge and Emerald Medallion and some awesome mana related cards. Being a mono green deck, the Medallion will provide a ton of value throughout the game. The Henge is just another win more card, but its cost reduction will almost always reduce it to just 2 green mana. First up is Bow and Nylea herself. The bow provides blanket death touch to our creatures. Like I mentioned before, this synergizes very well with trample to get even more damage through to our opponents. Nylea is really just redundancy for our commander. If Baru is ever removed, our worms are normally easy to chump block, so Nylea just makes sure we can always get some damage through. Cage Sun and Zendikar Resurgent will double up our mana production to help get the worms out earlier. In my test games, I always ramped pretty aggressively, so I didn't need these cards, but they're both good options to provide some additional utility for your deck. Loyal Guardian and Lurking Predators are 2 more cards generally just good for this deck. A Guardian can continue to anthem our creatures more and more throughout the game. Predators is a very effective card in Commander in general. You'll be surprised with just how many triggers you'll get throughout the game between everyone's spells, and it really draws out an answer from your opponents. I didn't cover every card in this deck or every suggestion I have for Baru, so if you'd like to see the rest, check out the link in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider clicking the like button and subscribing to the channel. Comment below on cards you think synergize well with this commander, and if you have any suggestions for commanders to build in the future. Thank you so much for watching, good luck, and have fun.